I've admired Jennifer's work for a really long time, and I think she's kind of one of these photographers who has put in the work year after year after year, and this kind of myriad of work, for newspapers, commercial work, but her personal work as well. And it's just kind of this obvious joy in photography that I see from her all the time, and it's just always exciting to see that. And so I'm just really excited to have her here, and thanks to everybody for coming, and now it's your turn.
Thank you, Patrick, for asking me here and for that introduction, which really described me in a nice way. And thank you to all of you for coming here. Wow. I see so many people I know here and love. It's a little like a funeral that I get to be alive. I get to be alive for it. And I have to do the talking. But I'm really glad to be here. So I have taken a lot of photos over 50 years. And by the way, this is not, although Patrick wrote a lovely description that made this sound like a major retrospective, it's not. The photos that are hanging in the library, while they're ones I like a lot, I say that they were curated by sewage. They're the prints that I happen to have that survived the sewage overflow in my basement. So it's by no means a comprehensive exhibit, but you get an idea if you want to see some prints. And I am going to show photos over 50 years in the PowerPoint. So it's been a lot of photos over 50 years, but so tonight, to keep it short, I'm going to focus mainly on the ones I've taken in Maryland. Oh, except the first two. So this was taken in Massachusetts in 1972. It was never printed until recently. I just discovered it. It was the first roll of film that I took with a 35 millimeter and processed myself very badly, which is why there are these cloudy aberrations all over the picture. But I really like the flaws, and I wanted to include these because I thought it would be fun to start with recognizing that sometimes my mistakes are a really good thing. So if I found it easy to put words together, I would not be a photographer at all. I came to Baltimore in 1975 to go to college. I went to Johns Hopkins and studied writing. And while I did get that degree, along the way, I found that making photos was just more fun. Writing, my hat is off to all my friends who are writers here tonight. Writing is really hard, and photography is a lot easier. And it just became a really joyful way for me to explore my new city. When I first arrived in Baltimore, it was summer and really hot, and there was very little air conditioning in 1975. And everybody was out on their stoops doing stuff, living life, because it was too hot inside. And right away, I was just charmed by the sights and wanted to wander the neighborhoods and photograph people. And I found it was a great way to connect with people. These are some of those earliest photos. There was just so much happening in the streets. Here I spotted this excellent window display. And I waited there a while until the right person came along to pose. And he was so obliging, and he even hid his cigarette behind his back. I found that twins often crossed my path, and I quickly fell in love with the spontaneity and synchronicity, what felt like meaningful coincidences of my wandering and noticing. So I started shooting for the Hopkins school paper, the newsletter, so that I could have access to a darkroom. And this is that darkroom. I came across this recently, too. The newsletter was in a little stone building set deep into a swamp. And we all worked all night to put out the newsletter, and often the building would flood, and we would roll up our pants and wade in knee-deep water to put out the paper. This is the paste-up room in the newsletter, the headquarters. And this is where I fell in with a very determined bunch of Hopkins students who loved journalism and who started City Squeeze in 1977, which then became City Paper in 1978. City Paper was a weekly alternative tabloid paper that would go on to survive in one form or another for 40 years. A good run. I had multiple roles at the paper in those early years, but mostly I took photos. Being a staff photographer gave me permission to access political junkets. This is a young Carl Stokes on a swing. Drag and strip joints, the morgue, bingo halls like this. Really, any place I was curious about. I think you all know who these people are. This is backstage with Liberace and Mayor Schaefer. And this was taken just a few months before Liberace died. This was a story about a controversial landfill. The neighbors didn't want the landfill there. I went to the land. It was just this big, barren field. And I actually found that magazine there and propped it open to try to illustrate the neighbors' objections. The headlines in City Paper were often photo-led or inspired by whatever photo we got, which was a really fun thing about City Paper. I photographed people with anorexia at Johns Hopkins Hospital. The hospital would become my best single source of compelling stories and assignments, and continues to be my main client to this day. And I'm very grateful for the way so many people have let me into their lives while they were patients in the hospital. This was covering a Right to Life convention for the City Paper, where I searched for a photo that would somehow represent visually a sense of dueling perspectives. Aside from assignments, I shot a random photo for page 3 every week. This was something that caught my eye but was unrelated to any editorial content. I loved the freedom this gave me to do what I loved doing most, which was to wander around and find whatever spoke to me. I'm going to show you a few of those now. Some of these are as reproduced in the newspaper, so they're not very good quality. And then I'll show some clearer ones. But obviously that's the harbor from Federal Hill. There's a photographer from Finland named Pentti Samelahti who said, "You don't take a photo, the photo gives itself to you." And I found this to be true. Shooting for me is not just about me trying to speak through pictures, but about getting to listen. Because this is what I really like, listening to the way the world speaks in visual ways. I would continue shooting the page 3 photo every week for 17 years, but City Paper's paycheck was meager. In the early days, when I was paid at all, I got $15 every 2 weeks. So in 1980, I got a real job as a staff photographer at the News American. In those days, there were 3 daily newspapers in Baltimore: the Sun, the Evening Sun, and the Hearst Daily, the News American. This is the photography crew of the News American photographers in 1980. Is Paul White here? Yes, yes. I was hoping you'd be here. This guy hired me in 1980. And I'm so glad you did. You took a chance on me, Chief. And it was a great job. And don't leave here until I've had a chance to talk to you, please. I loved that job, shooting for a daily paper. I wish I had photos of the photo department there. I don't. But I can tell you it was entirely windowless. There was this loud ticking noise that was the darkroom. It was an audible darkroom timer. And it was just like being in a submarine. This was before computers and cell phones, of course. So we photographers would get assignments scrawled on a paper notepad with an address, and we'd run out to shoot. Then we'd return to the submarine to process the negatives, make prints in the darkroom before heading out to the next assignment, sometimes covering as many as 5 stories on a shift. This is a young me back then in the News American submarine. You can see I'm wearing a pager for fast-breaking stories. We sometimes sent pictures to the wire services over a rotary phone. And I've since then learned that I was the only full-time female staff photographer in the paper's whole 200-year history. I'll take that. Those guys, though, whose pictures you just saw, they were awesome. They each had a different shooting style. They had tons of experience. They had amazing stories, and I miss them. Oh, and I made $12,000 a year, which felt like a fortune in 1980. My stint there was memorable but brief, just under 2 years. as the paper was soon on its way out of business and began laying off its youngest staff in 1982. The office was down at the Inner Harbor, and I think the real estate became really valuable, and I think it's a parking lot now. But while I was there, I got to shoot fires. This was the Academy of the Visitation in Roland Park, which burned in 1981. And this was a landmark, a Baltimore landmark at the corner of Mount Royal and Charles, a strip club called Club Legal with a huge sign. In those days, it seemed like there weren't police lines, or maybe I just got to cross them with my press pass, but I've noticed now the police block off a whole block when there's a fire and nobody can get close. But in 1980, I could stand right beside the firefighters while they were working and nobody minded. This was a row house fire in Locust Point. To make this picture, I stood inside the burnt house to get a more intimate perspective. A young family of 4 lived here and lost everything they owned, but they all got out safely. Aunts, uncles, neighbors, and the family pastor all came together to help the family get back on their feet. I remember the story quoted one woman saying, "South Baltimore takes care of her own." This was one of my most memorable assignments at the News American. I spent a couple of weeks on the bone marrow transplant ward in Johns Hopkins Hospital, photographing some of the very first bone marrow transplants performed in children in the US. These patients had less than even odds of surviving the transplant process alone, but it was their only hope of living longer. I got to know several young children who were very playful and surrounded by their families, but I was particularly struck by this teenage boy. He was only a few years younger than me at the time, and he was more aloof and alone. I wanted to show the way he did this and how it was different from the young children's way. And I wanted to show his quiet sense of defiance. Some photos and some people stick with me, and this is one. Another assignment I never forgot, being sent to photograph this woman whose daughter and mother had been murdered in her house by a young 18-year-old hitman her son-in-law had hired. She didn't speak, just took me into her daughter's room and held her photo. Tears rolled down her face as I shot this, and I was struck by just how much trust a person gives to offer a photo like this. You don't take a photo like this, it is given to you. Many days, the News American would send me out to roam the streets looking for weather shots, and this was my favorite thing. These were random found photos that implied what kind of weather it was that day. So I'd find a kid eating a popsicle, or someone using a mattress as a trampoline, or a grown man being unapologetically weird. Or kids and pets sitting in their doorways on a hot day. Sometimes I get invited in a stranger's row house, as I did with these very tired grandparents. I found the details here endlessly fascinating, what they were watching on TV, the wedding photo on the wall, the phone receiver on the floor. Around Christmas time, I was assigned to go to the Towson Mall to find a holiday photo. And I came back with this image of Santa coming down the mall escalator. I don't think the editors were always thrilled with my offerings at the time. As I recall, they found this one an oddly bleak view of Christmas. But I always felt it was a win to capture the emotional underside of a thing. So since 1982, after leaving the News American, I have worked entirely freelance ever since. I've photographed for various kinds of print jobs, for nonprofits and institutions. This is a visitor's guide for the Baltimore Museum of Art. And I've done freelance assignments for magazines all over the country and in other countries, but sticking with Maryland, this is Warfield's, a local business magazine that gave me many wonderful assignments to photograph notable people in Maryland, like Mary Pat Clark. This was the cover that ran of Mary Pat, but years later, I found this outtake, which I really like better. This was a Warfield story about the Port of Baltimore. I always liked photographing John Waters for different publications. Besides being a really nice man, he's got such a great breadth to his creativity, and collaborating with him is inspiring and fun. These are two of my favorite outtakes that were never actually published anywhere. They weren't punished and they weren't published. I rarely shot color in the 80s, although occasionally it was required of me. I hadn't yet found my way with color and kept getting the exposures wrong, and it just didn't feel comfortable for me then. This was an assignment to cover Ocean City for the Washington Post magazine. I was drawn to the solitude of this woman and how she just really abandoned herself to the sand. When the Washington Post assigned me to photograph G. Gordon Liddy, they had first assigned another photographer to shoot his portrait. But the story was that Liddy got enraged at that photographer and threw him off the shoot. He then agreed to try again to be photographed under two conditions: that it be a different photographer, that's where I came in, and that the photographer not be allowed in the room with him. Instead, I would be allowed to photograph him through a tiny window in the door to the studio where he was busy broadcasting his radio show. There were actually two doors, one on the side with a tiny window. So I brought a light and I shone the light through the side window. And then I used a long lens through the tiny window in the door and got this. I'm not sure how he felt about it. I had to wonder if he might have preferred the other photographer's shot in the end. But the Post and I liked it. I was assigned to photograph Bethlehem steelworkers for Regardi's magazine. The catch was I was not allowed to photograph at Bethlehem Steel, and I had to find the steel workers myself. So I went to the bars in Sparrows Point where they hung out, where I explained myself to them and was able to persuade some of them to be photographed at their homes with their families. This suited everybody because who doesn't like to pose with their families? I liked the way the girls' tights are polka dotted like the leopard in the painting. Synchronicity. This steel worker invited me to his granddaughter's birthday party. And I heard about this one. He was the oldest living retiree at Bethlehem Steel in those days. But I couldn't find him. There were no cell phones, and he was never home. And it was just really hard to track him down. But eventually I learned that he had shacked up with his girlfriend in her trailer. So I went there and photographed him, and even the girlfriend was willing to be in the picture. A picture given, not taken. For various editorial magazines and also print collateral pieces for hospitals and nonprofits, I was very happy to be assigned to photograph so much of life, from births, like this one, to deaths. I'm going to stray from Baltimore, from Maryland for a minute, because I love this story. A magazine assigned me to photograph Gladys, a lay midwife in Alabama, delivering her 2,000th baby. A lay midwife is someone who has no formal medical training, but who learned to deliver babies through apprenticeship and experience. And in this very rural part of Alabama, the nearest hospital was hours and hours away. So many people relied on Gladys to deliver them in her home. She was well known and respected in her community, and she had a kind of deep-seated, unconventional, slightly irreverent wisdom to share. She did things her own way. I was sent to Alabama 2 weeks before the baby was due because Gladys said, according to the moon and the tides, the baby would be born exactly 6 days early. I loved getting to hang out with her every day for 8 days. Everywhere we went, we encountered children she had delivered and families who loved her. I photographed her with some of these children. We went fishing with her friend, who she called Mr. Boy, and she claimed him to be 104 years old. We went to church. We went to the cemetery to visit her daughter's grave, and she brought a picture of her daughter to show me and told me about her. And then the 2,000th baby was born exactly on the day Gladys had predicted. Much of my professional work in the last 4 decades has involved children and medicine. I've shot for many purposes at Johns Hopkins Hospital and continue to do so to this day. This was the cover of one of their annual reports, A Boy on a Swing, which became a billboard. I just came across this recently. I'd totally forgotten. I illustrated 2 educational brochures about children getting heart transplants and followed 2 child's transplants. This was one of those children. We made a beautiful book out of this boy's story, and then as soon as it was published, he died unexpectedly. Another unforgettable story in the hospital's Children's Center was about their pediatric hospice program. This program allowed terminally ill children to live out their lives at home, surrounded by family, instead of in the hospital. I followed several families through this transition. This photo and story is about one such family. They had 4 sons, and their twin boys were diagnosed with a degenerative disease, Batten disease, around the age of 2. And thanks to the support and guidance of the pediatric hospice program, they were able to live at home with their brothers and parents for their entire lives until they died. I'll never forget the time I spent with this family. In the 1990s, I decided to run the film through the camera twice. Of course, now with digital, you can have control over creating layered images. But I was shooting film in those days, and with film, the result is pretty unplanned. And at first, the element of surprise added to the fun of shooting this way. There are ways I could balance the lights a little bit, the lights and darks, so that I knew 2 layers would bleed through. But essentially, it was blind guesswork. This series I shot for the Baltimore School for the Arts was published in an international trade journal, and suddenly I was getting hired by lots of people who wanted this look. For a while, it was fun to work with this process and the element of surprise. And I really love some of these. But as the stakes grew, the bigger clients, the bigger paying clients, the ad clients, the pressure to produce a photo when I was shooting essentially blind began to feel absurd. These jobs were some of the highest paying jobs of my whole career, and yet I couldn't see what I was doing. And so what started as a spontaneous, fun kind of thing, freeing kind of thing, eventually it had to become kind of formulaic to guarantee usable results. I wasn't too sorry when this style of shooting fizzled out. Always, I return to the street photos, which have an authenticity that inspires me the most. I like to imagine this woman in the wheelchair is considering a new way of thinking about her wheels. And this faded butterfly appears to me to be like a thought balloon of hope above this boy's head. I'm happy when people trust me enough to do what they do unselfconsciously. Sometimes a picture can happen as if I'm invisible, and that really pleases me. Seconds after I took this one, I got a bucket of cold water dumped over my head, reminding me I'm not actually invisible. and sometimes not welcome. For years, I wore my camera everywhere because I like the slight moments that happen in ordinary places. Like this boy in the ladies' room at the mall. I'm always looking for shots with a sense of mystery or uncertainty. I want to make your eye travel around the edges, seeing everything that's in the frame, but also it's so much about making you wonder about what is felt but unseen. There's a lot of memory and nostalgia in all photos, because each photo is a moment already lost. When I completely transitioned to digital about 20 years ago, I began shooting color as that was the default setting. And somehow it started to make sense to me. This is the night of 1,000, no, the night of 100 Elvises. It's always 1,000 to me, but it's only 100. And I started to make more urban landscapes. I feel grateful for the way the world speaks in visual ways, and I try to listen. I'm going to try not to talk for a few of these so you can just listen to these images with your eyes. Sometimes I don't have to leave my car. Here too. This was inside the state institution, Rosewood. And this was the Cinderella Castle in the Enchanted Forest. You know, I happened by there and I found a hole in the chain link fence and I went in and photographed this, and a month later it was demolished. The timing was just so perfect. I really enjoy teaming up with Rafael Alvarez, and we've covered lots of local stories together. When his mom died a couple of years ago, he called me and asked me to photograph her 70-year-old wedding dress. that he'd discovered in her basement while emptying out the house. So here is Glow's dress. This was one of my most favorite assignments ever. That's Druid Park. This is kind of a whole story. There's some stuff going on the left, but what I really want you to notice is there's a body under the water. This was after Freddie Gray. I'm so grateful to the people who've let me in to witness their sorrows and joys, and it's been a really beautiful way to make my experience of life so much larger and fuller. This is the day it was 107 degrees in Baltimore. I knew I could find an open fire hydrant. And a lot of people ask me how I got this shot, so I thought I'd take you to the scene. There were actually a lot of people jumping in that fire hydrant. And I photographed them all for a while. But then this one woman, her athleticism was just so amazing. And so I asked if she could take a turn alone. And she tried some jumps and cartwheels until we got it just right. The last kind of work I'm going to talk about is my work around people with developmental disabilities. For the past 20 years, I've been not only photographing, but also writing and producing videos about the particular joys and challenges of life with developmental disabilities. It's personally meaningful work to me. One of my children was born with very significant disabilities, and doing this work has been a way for me to learn and understand a little better our ever-changing and very complex support system. So I'm going to show you a few stills of these children with family members. A lot of these projects were educational, informational, or advocacy related, and there are many publications on the Maryland Developmental Disability Council's website that has my work.